Yves, is part of your role to help parliamentarians determine whether Canada is on a sustainable fiscal path? Is that as part of your analysis?
It is. It is part of the mandate of the office to provide independent analysis and information to parliamentarians on the state of the nation's finances. So we will do an analysis of the new fiscal track and try to assess its long-term sustainability when taking into account various factors such as demographics, long-term productivity trends. We release every year a fiscal sustainability report that looks at the long-term fiscal sustainability of the federal government as well as provincial governments in the country. And when I say long-term, we look at the next 75 years, and we define sustainability as ending that 75-year period at a debt to GDP ratio that is not higher than at the beginning of the period, taking into account demographics, expected economic potential, labor productivity, interest rates, and so on. And of course, with additional spending, structural spending in this budget, that changes the long-term fiscal sustainability of the Government of Canada.
It's interesting that you mentioned the provincial budgets as well, because I've been doing a little bit of comparing and contrasting. Obviously, some budgets have been released already. Alberta is projecting a surplus, a budgetary surplus. Ontario is projecting a surplus within the next couple of years, for instance. Ontario as well, you mentioned the 0.3% growth projection in the federal budget. I believe Ontario is projecting a 0.2% growth for this fiscal year in Ontario. So that seems to be aligned fairly well. Are those the kinds of comparators you're looking at as well?
Yes, but for provinces, when we look at long-term fiscal sustainability, we look at factors that are unique to individual provinces, such as population growth, the composition of population. Some provinces have older populations or populations that are aging faster than others. So that has a significant impact on their long-term fiscal sustainability. As well, some provinces are receiving equalization, others not. And that has a significant impact on the long-term fiscal sustainability across provinces because transfers to provinces are based on fiscal capacity. So there's a lot of factors that come into play in determining whether a province is fiscally sustainable over the long term or not. So it's a complex exercise when trying to take into account what is known so far, of course, and that requires making a series of assumptions.
I notice as well in the Ontario budget that they've set aside in a contingency fund, I can't remember the total, whether it's $3 or $4 billion or something in that magnitude anyway, it's essentially a rainy day fund. If we do slip into a recession, perhaps it will help shore up the financial picture of that budget. Is there something similar in the federal budget, do you know?
No, there hasn't been a buffer of that kind for a while in federal budgets. And personally, I think it's something that is useful to ensure that the government meets its fiscal targets year in, year out, that it doesn't exceed its expected deficit or surplus. But the federal government doesn't seem to be that concerned about hitting a specific deficit target. So that's probably why they've decided to abandon that long-standing practice of including a provision or a buffer or an adjustment for risk. It has different names at different points in time. But when you're not targeting a specific level of deficit, when you're just content with having an approximate number or a declining debt to GDP ratio, and as I was alluding to, a fiscal anchor that changes over time, they're focusing on achieving certain policy goals, but a deficit target or a debt to GDP ratio is not one of the policy goals that they're aiming to achieve.
That's very interesting because there has been, I guess, more post-COVID calls upon the federal government to reestablish a fiscal anchor that is good and prudent budgeting and fiscal management, but may not be the tallest priority for at least evidenced in this and previous budget hasn't happened. But I'm going to continue our conversation with Mr. Yves Giroux, Parliamentary Budget Officer, after this brief break. Please stay with us.